This is easily the most stylish Oracle Druid build in Path of Exile 2. Using Bone Blast, we only press one button to cast triple element tornadoes, fire, ice, and lightning, capable of clearing all game content, including high-tier Ubers. This is my one-button Bone Blast Oracle Druid. Now, starting with the skill gems, of course, up top, you will see we have Bone Blast, the main and pretty much only component to this build. Now, one thing with Bone Blast, it is not a regular skill gem. You can only acquire Bone Blast through a Bone Wand, whether it's rare or unique. Bone Blast is an implicit spell of the item. And once you're in late game, you of course want to have a level 20 Bone Blast, not only for more damage, but also to acquire the 5th support gem socket. A level 19 Bone Blast only has 4 support gem sockets. And with Bone Blast, a lot of the damage scaling does come from levels. So here I'm using a Physical Mastery for +1 Phys skills. I'm using Burning Inscription, which gives us fiery ignited ground with our Bone Blasts. I'm using Rapid Casting for cast speed, of course. I use Mobility and Spell Cascade for the AoE when I'm mapping or just killing mobs. This is the setup. But when I'm bossing, I will swap over to Heft and Concentrated Area, which will scale our damage greatly. Of course, we no longer have the coverage, but for a boss, that is just fine. This will absolutely shred the bosses with this setup. Since we are an Oracle Druid, easily the most busted ascendancy in the game at the moment, we are using Cast on Crit. Since we do have inevitable crits with our ascendancy, Cast on Crit is tremendously powerful. And to synergize with the Burning Inscription on our Bone Blast, I'm running Tornadoes. So as we're Bone Blasting, we're very often casting Tornadoes, which is a physical spell which deals damage over time, and its damage increases even further if it absorbs elemental ground effects, such as the Ignited Ground. But on top of that, we are also running Chilled Ground and Shocked Ground, which we will go over a little bit more. And to support the Tornadoes, I'm using Diala's Desire for +1 in skills to raise its damage, but importantly, with my particular equipment setup, I needed a little bit of extra spirit, so the +10 quality of supported skills gives us more spirit through the Cast on Crit. And to support Tornado's damage, I'm using Swift Affliction, which gives us 30% more non-ailment damage over time. Tornado is a damage over time spell, so this is some solid damage. Using Overabundance gives us +1 to limit, which means we can have 2 tornadoes on the field at once, and this is quite nice against bosses since the tornadoes will stack with one another, dealing massive damage. And lastly, I'm running Boundless Energy for more energy creation, since Cast on Crit does still require energy to build up. Of course, this just helps us get more tornadoes. Now, one interchangeable gem here could be Overabundance. If you find you're having energy issues, which likely isn't the case, you could then add in Energy Retention instead of Overabundance. And moving on, we are using Mana Remnants just for a solid source of mana regeneration. It will periodically drop remnants, and we are supporting it with Harmonic Remnants 1, so we can pick them up from further, as well as Remnant Potency. And with some of my extra spirit, I slapped in Clarity 1 for more mana regen. We are running Wolfpack and Cast on Minion Death as an engine that passively happens to assist with our damage and the utility of our build. So with Infernal Legion, the wolves die, you can see, after just a few seconds of spawning. After their death, they cause a small explosion because of Feeding Frenzy and minion instability. Now this damage isn't too important, but importantly, we also are running Aminamu's Tithe, which gives us a chance to receive an Abyssal modifier, which can benefit our survivability and damage, but this is just kind of a bit of a bonus, as well as Romira's Requital, which gives us a little bit of damage reduction and a little bit more survivability. But the main component of having wolf packs here with Infernal Legion is that we can then use Cast on Minion Death. So this is a very large component of my build, and what I'm using Cast on Minion Death for is our Chilled Ground generator. And to do that, I'm using Frost Bomb. When Frost Bomb casts, it drops a cold remnant on the ground. After I pick up a remnant, the next Ice Nova that casts will create Chilled Ground. And since this happens passively every several seconds, we are constantly creating Chilled Ground in our radius. And now to make this even more powerful, I'm adding Magnified Area as well as Encroaching Ground. So you'll see we have a map-wide coverage of Chilled Ground. Now you're asking, why the heck do you need Chilled Ground in your Bone Blast build? Well, again, that goes back to our Tornado. So Tornado increases its damage over time per elemental damage type absorbed. So we have the ignited ground from Bone Blast, we have the chilled ground from our minion generator, and we also have shocked ground being granted to us by our gear, which we'll look at shortly. And to make this chilled ground generator operate a little better, I'm using short fuse. This makes the frost bombs detonate significantly faster. That way you can pick up the remnant quicker, causing more chilled ground faster. This generator is so powerful and just happens passively. It gives us so much value for only 90 spirit in total. It is so good. And that's all we have. It's very, very simple, this setup, with only the one button Bone Blast. We aren't even using weapon swaps. This is all you need. And one note about the mana consumption in this build. Now, Bone Blast itself, because it is an implicit basic skill, it doesn't actually cost any mana. You can see it costs 0 mana. So that is really, really great, meaning you can just spam this as much as you want, and our only mana cost comes from our cast on minion death and our cast on critical. So every time a tornado is cast, it uses mana. Every time Frost Bomb and Ice Nova are cast, it uses mana. But specifically with my cast on minion death, to save mana costs, I'm using level 2 Frost Bomb and level 2 Ice Nova to keep the mana costs down. The reason being, I don't actually care about having high damage from these two abilities. It's simply to create cold remnants to fuel the chilled ground. Now you might say, Troy, you can get more exposure on enemies from Frost Bomb if you level it up. This is very true. If you were trying to min-max this build, absolutely, use a higher level of Frost Bomb. You can inflict more exposure on enemies with it, but in my particular setup, I need the mana as much as possible, so that's why I'm using a low-level Frost Bomb and a low-level Ice Nova. Of course, Tornado you want as high of a level as possible, since this is one of our primary damage dealers. And now looking at the gear, on the topic of elemental ground effects, we are using Wake of Destruction unique boots. This gives us shocked ground while moving, which lasts for 8 seconds. So basically, if we cast a tornado on top of this shocked ground, it will absorb lightning damage into its dot, which helps greatly with our damage. And the star of the show is, of course, the Bone Wand. This is mandatory in this build since this is the only way to acquire Bone Blast. It is very important that you get yourself a level 20 Bone Blast base, since that will give your Bone Blast 5 support gems. Otherwise, modifiers you're looking for here are plus levels, plus physical spell levels, physical spell damage, gain extra fizz, essentially anything that increases your damage you want. Now this wand in particular is insane, so take it with a grain of salt. You can definitely use something not as wild as this. If you're running this build through the campaign, I would implore you to use the Sanguine Diviner if you're on Trade League. You can pick these up for quite cheap, and you can purchase new ones as your character levels up to get a higher level Bone Blast easily. But this is a really, really cheap way to get going with the Bone Blast build. Now, other very important pieces for this build will be your Amulet and your Focus. Since we can get spell levels on these two pieces, these will contribute greatly to your damage. So on your neck, the priority is spell levels as well as spirit, since we're relying quite heavily on spirit in this build. Otherwise, spell damage, resistances, mana, things like that would be great. In terms of the anoint, I'm using acceleration. This is a very affordable anoint, which gives you great value with movement speed and skill speed, but you absolutely can anoint something else, which will give more damage. However, many of these are significantly more expensive. And for the focus, of course, you want to get as many spell levels as possible. Otherwise, get as much energy shield and mana as you can on this piece. And since our build is relying a fair amount on spirit, of course it is important to get spirit in your body armor and your amulet. If you find this too difficult to acquire, an affordable option would be to use a scepter instead of the focus. Now, of course, with a scepter, we are sacrificing some very, very great stats like energy shield, mana, and spell levels. But in replacement, you get yourself a very easy source of spirit, or a potential best in slot piece would be a Palm of the Dreamer in your offhand. Now this item can be very, very expensive, so it might be tough to get your hands on, but that would be a very powerful offhander. And on the topic of other very expensive items, if you wanted to crank up your damage even further on this build, of course you would want to run a +4 all skills Vertex Mask. This would likely be your best in slot, but I like keeping these builds nice and cheap and accessible, and the energy shield is also pretty nice on these helmets. And for the chest, you can see I also have a nice hefty amount of spirit, as well as many resistances as possible and as much energy shield as possible. As for the gloves, it's a very similar idea to the other pieces. You want energy shield, you want mana. You can also get critical damage bonus since we are always critting. That helps nicely with your damage. And for the desecrate on the gloves, you can get yourself chance to gain arcane surge when you critically hit. Arcane surge basically just gives you more move speed and more cast speed. And since we're always critting, we will pretty much always have arcane surge up. And as for the rings, this is an opportunity for a ton of mana, as well as resistances. As for the belt, I'm using Darkness Enthroned simply because my resists without it were quite good. So I was able to socket in 21 Chaos Res, as well as increased effect of Arcane Surge on you. Now this is really, really strong with this belt. Again, since because we pretty much always have Arcane Surge, this is just free cast speed and free movement speed. But if you're struggling with resists, I would recommend using something just with some nice chunky resists to help you kind of balance out your build a little bit. And as for the weapon swap, well, I'm not using a weapon swap. You can absolutely run a weapon swap in this build, but with my particular setup here, I am intentionally keeping it so we are only using one button Bone Blast, and it is still absolutely viable and can clear the majority of the game, including tier 2 Ubers, if not higher. This still needs to be tested. But if you were to run a weapon swap, you can maybe use a staff with a Sigil of Power. Of course, this then makes you have to press other buttons, but that would probably be your best bet when you're bossing. Another idea I had with weapon swaps was maybe having a second Bone Wand. I would then have 2 Bone Blasts to cast. It would no longer be a 1 button, but it would be a 1 ability build. The idea is that 1 Bone Blast would be set more around mapping and AoE clearing, and another would be more focused on boss killing. As for the flasks, I'm using Lavianjas just for a constant mana regen, since we do use a fair amount of mana with our cast on abilities. This is just a nice quality of life. And just a nice life flask with instant recovery is always a great quality of life, and use whatever charms you find you need. Now allow me to demonstrate how Tornado works and why we're focused in the elemental ground effects. So again, the description of Tornado here is dealing physical damage per second, deal additional damage per second of each absorbed element type. So we can absorb ignited ground, shocked ground, and chilled ground, increasing our damage significantly on Tornado. At the moment, I have it removed out of cast on critical so I can manually cast it for demonstrative purposes. You can see here, Tornado, well, it's wind, as you would expect. A default Tornado is only dealing physical damage. But with our shocked ground, if we walk into it, you can see it picks up the lightning damage, giving a huge damage increase. In addition to that, we can add our ignited ground from our Bone Blast. So now we have fire lightning tornadoes. And our last step is with our wolf generator when we create chilled ground. So when the wolves explode, you can see I can pick up a cold remnant on the ground. On the next frost nova, it will create chilled ground. And with encroaching ground, it'll give us map-wide chilled ground. So now the tornadoes are cold, lightning, and fire when all three are working together. This creates a very powerful damage over time, which can stack on a boss. Since we can do 2 tornadoes with overabundance, it shreds bosses and it looks amazing. Now looking at the ascendancy tree, we are of course an Oracle Druid. This ascendancy is so powerful. Enjoy it while you can in the 0.4 patch. I would anticipate it will be nerfed to a degree in the future, but importantly, we move up along the top here to grab inevitable critical hits. If you highlight this, it tells you exactly how it functions. Basically, if a hit could potentially be a critical hit, but doesn't roll a critical hit, it will re-roll that value instantaneously until you crit. Meaning, all of your hits will be critical hits, but every re-roll that occurs in the background will essentially reduce your damage. So that's why it is still important to build some critical hit chance in your build to reduce the amount of rerolls that occur. But this node is so strong, and I'm sure this is what primarily will be nerfed in the future. We also come along the bottom side here to grab Paths Not Taken, which gives us access to Oracle specific nodes on the tree, and we come up to Entwined Realities, which gives us the ability to build within certain keystone nodes, which can be very, very powerful. We move left, starting off with increased spell damage, and take a quick right over to grab a little bit of area of effect, since we do need to scale scale our Bone Blast radius quite a bit on this build. It is very tiny by default. I continue down to the left here. We pick ourselves up a couple of critical hit chance and critical damage bonus nodes. Continuing west, we have these really great physical damage nodes. We grab some of the Path Unseen nodes here from the Oracle specific nodes with some more critical damage bonus as well as critical hit chance. There are some really great area of effect nodes here as we move left, and grab yourself a jewel. And moving not too far north, we have a few more area of effect nodes we want to grab. And coming back, we move up to grab ourselves a few more area of effect nodes. And moving up, we grab our first keystone, Scarred Faith. Now, the keystone itself we don't care about. If anything, it's not applicable to our build whatsoever because we don't actually have Energy Shield. But with our Ascendancy, we are now able to grab any node within this radius without having to be connected. So we do exactly that. We grab Nurturing Nature, which gives us 40% mana regen while in full life. Well, since our mana will be consumed before our life is, we pretty much always will have this increased mana regen. Very nice. We grab Arcane Nature, which gives us increased effect of Arcane Surge and spell damage while we have Arcane Surge. And like we saw with the gear, we will pretty much always have Arcane Surge because we acquire it through critical hits. And we pick up a couple other really great nodes here. 15% flat increased damage, quite nice. Pick up another jewel here moving northwest as we continue upwards. Here we pick up a few very nice mana regen nodes, as well as 10% chance to gain Arcane Surge when you critical hit. So in combination with our gloves and a couple other nodes up ahead, we will always have Arcane Surge. And here we have some more area of effect nodes, which we'd like to pick up, as well as some spell damage, which is quite nice. And at the intersection here, you can see we have two more keystones. Let's come down to Wild Surge Incantation. Now this one is actually a very powerful node. This increases our tornado damage drastically at the sacrifice of duration. Now, if you prefer to have longer lasting tornadoes, you could likely sacrifice this point, but the damage is very nice. But this is interchangeable. And within this radius, we can also pick up Explosive Impact for a nice 15% increased area of effect with a little bit of bonus fire damage there. And we also grab Profane Commander for 4% increased spirit. I needed a little bit more spirit with my gear. You may not need this, but this is a nice flexible point if you need to min-max the spirit in your build. And we move up to grab Mind Over Matter. We take this so that our mana essentially becomes our life pool. And that's why we focused so greatly on mana in our gear as well as Energy Shield. Basically, mana becomes our defensive layer. Within this radius, we can grab two of these Arcane Surge nodes to increase the effect as well as increase our odds of getting it when we critical hit. And I also grab Storm Charged, which gives us an easy 40% elemental damage if we've crit recently. We move up to grab another jewel slot. Coming up top here, grab these Oracle specific nodes, increase damage, fizz damage, and cower before the first ones. Just massive damage nodes here. Continuing to the right and downwards, we come over to yet another keystone, Eldritch Battery. So this works greatly with Mind Over Matter. This converts all of our Energy Shield to mana. So all the Energy Shield that we were putting on our gear is now our mana. So that's why we were so focused on that earlier on. And in the radius of Eldritch Battery, we pick up a ton of these mana regeneration rate nodes, since again, that is our survivability, as well as some nice critical hit chance and critical hit damage spells within the radius. As for the jewels, these are very flexible. Find yourself stats like critical spell damage bonus, spell damage, or area of effect if you want to cover as much ground as possible, but you have some nice flexibility in these slots. Looking at the stats on this character, you can see pretty much the only thing we have is mana. That is our only defensive layer, so it can be a bit tough at times. We are pretty squishy with 0 armor, evasion, or block, but we seem to do just fine. With the combination of the nearly maxed out resistances and a decent chunk of mana, we look alright. In terms of damage on Bone Blast, with the map clearing set up with Spell Cascade and Mobility, it sits at a base DPS of 58k. Now this will increase once we start hitting mobs, as you can see. Let's run in here. Bone Blast damage itself increases to about 80,000 DPS, and of course that's not accounting for our tornado damage. And when we're on our boss swap, going into Concentrated Area and Heft, it jumps up significantly. So the base damage sits at about 126k, and when we start hitting mobs, it jumps up to about 175k DPS. Now looking at the damage on the tornado, it is quite significant here. You can see base damage physical per second is 11,000 DPS, fire damage per second is 20,000, cold damage 20,000, lightning damage 20,000. So when you start stacking tornadoes on top of each other with overabundance, you are dealing tens of thousands of damage per second per tornado. In addition to the Bone Blast damage, it is significant. It melts bosses. It costs almost no mana. You have one button to press. It is very, very strong. And that's it for the build, guys. Thank you so much for watching once again and sticking around. Let's end off with some T16 map gameplay using Irradiated, Breach, and Delirium Mirror tablets. All right, see you in the next one, guys. Out of Detroit.